Welcome to the podcast. I'm Angela Bobier, and this is Life in the Talbot Settlement, brought to you by Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. In this series, we will do our best to give you a full appreciation of the history of Western Elgin County in southwestern Ontario, from First Nations to the early settlers to the 1950s. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge funding from Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Welcome to episode 46 of our podcast, Life in the Talbot Settlement. Today we're going to be talking about the historic Moorhouse doll, which resides here at Backus-Page House Museum. Backus-Page House Museum acquired the Moorhouse doll from David and Paula Neese in 2017. The Moorhouse doll was brought to Upper Canada by David's ancestor, Jane Hopkins Moorhouse, in 1824, having been given to her at around 1799. It was then passed from mother to eldest daughter as a confirmation gift. It arrived in Wallacestown in 1831 with Anne Moorhouse Pierce. The doll has spent most of its history in the Dunwich area, with a brief stay in Windsor and then Shakespeare, before returning to a permanent home in our museum. This doll represents a fine example of late 18th century doll making. Now we'll hear Muriel Aileen Moorhouse's story of the doll. I cannot remember the days, the time, morning, or afternoon, except it was early spring 1945. My husband Bernard had been posted from the RCAF station in Belleville to a town named Hagersville, where an immense training flying station was situated 4 miles out of town. I followed him from Belleville, found accommodations, 2 rooms upstairs, a kitchen, and a bedroom. This was now our 4th campsite during the war years. Once again, I set up housekeeping. One day that spring, a knock came at the door. I went down the stairs to answer it, opened the door, and there stood Ed Docker of Wallacestown. I had not seen Ed for many years. There he stood, his same wonderful friendly face, and as I recall it, was always a kindly smile and a real twinkle in his navy blue eyes. I invited him in, and as the two of us stood in the hallway, he handed me a box. It was a box in which women's slippers had been purchased, long and narrow, not wrapped, no string tied around it, but on the lid someone had written in pencil, Moorhouse, 1824. The silence was broken when Ed announced, "Fanny said you were to have this." In the following conversation, I found out that his wife, Anne Frances Fanny Backus, born 1874 and died 1939, had passed away. This came as quite a shock to me, for Fanny was a very special cousin in my life. Fanny was a living, walking book of knowledge of the family history. Her home was full of treasures, always making it a magic place for my family to visit. I was taken to this home many times as a child and into my teens. I always enjoyed Fanny and Ed. Fanny, before her death, had made certain that I, Muriel Aileen Moorhouse, was to have this box and its contents. So here was Ed, having driven all alone from Wallacestown to Hagersville. How he found out where I was living, I do not know, delivering this precious parcel to me and fulfilling his promise to Fanny. It was a promise I knew nothing about, nor was I aware of the contents of the box. Standing together, I opened the lid, and there she lay, a doll, looking up at us. Such eyes! I was speechless. I could not comprehend what this was all about. I could not believe such a wonderful treasure had come my way, a bit of family history. A history that had taken hours of my life and of my brother Hugh's to record. Some of this history actually lay in the box, and that box was now in my own 2 hands. D-Day arrived, and my husband requested discharge from the RCAF. July saw us moving to Colchester North, a township of Essex County, where his family resided. As we drove, we wondered what the world had to offer us, and our new possession, the doll. We found a new, larger box for the doll, so her precious petticoats and silk skirts could be opened up and not folded or crushed as they had been in the original long, narrow box. There she remained until we moved into our very own first official home in 1952. I purchased a special display case, carefully took her out of her box and stood her up on a proper stand, removed her poke bonnet so all the world could glimpse her lovely black cap of material and lace with some purple ribbon and a bit of her real hair. This cap, I now read, was never removed, and the hair was stuck on with gum, with ends poking out from beneath her caps. The poke bonnet is a pure delight. It is shaped with wire and made entirely out of black corded ribbon with a bit of lining, and it fits her head perfectly. There seems there may have been legs, but they are missing. The gloves on the hands were made of kid leather and stitched. She wears 3 petticoats of soft white material. The first is embroidered with French knots. The second, split down the middle, is a ruffle. The third, very fine stitches in the hem. The doll was greatly admired in her new setting and quietly rested among a collection of books and other Canadiana. Gracious years passed for us in this home at the Glen, in Colchester North, approximately 5 miles from the town of Essex. 46 years after the doll was gifted into my care, it was time to make changes in our lives. So we sold our country home and some 33 acres and moved to a lovely apartment in Windsor, Ontario. Alas, apartments don't allow for the accumulation of years. David C. Neese, our oldest son, and his wife Paula very kindly agreed to take care and watch over the doll for me. So off she went to Cars, south of Ottawa, and then to Waterloo. And finally, on June 23, 2002, she headed to a very lovely home and new setting outside Shakespeare near Stratford. While our daughter-in-law attended a ribbon-cutting event in St. Thomas for the Trans-Canada Trail organization, our daughter-in-law visited with friend and local artist Jenny Phillips. During their happy conversation, the subject of the doll came up, especially since the bicentennial celebration of the Talbot Settlement of 2003 was looming, and the doll came into the area in the early years of the settlement. That conversation resulted in a plan to preserve the memory of the doll through the artistic medium. Our son David and his wife Paula transported the doll to Dutton one day, where Jenny used 8 rolls of film in order to help her research. Then she rendered a true painting to print to be made available for purchase from her gallery frame shop, the Village Crier in Dutton, and the Backus-Page House Museum gift shop. I am very proud and most grateful to David and Paula, who have cared for the doll all these years, and who have made it possible for her to be shared and enjoyed by many, many more viewers, so as to hopefully create interest in coming generations. My knowledge of dolls was very limited. I knew that I had cherished, up to the 1920s and 30s, baby dolls to be dressed and put in a buggy. I never thought of any of my ancestors having dolls, not even my mother. This is an adult doll. Her clothes suggest this. And she is a doll to be admired and perhaps placed under a glass globe, called a vitrine, for show. For many years, my mind could only grasp that she might have belonged to young Maria, born 1821 and dying in 1824, who was 3 years old when she drowned in Kettle Creek shortly after her family's arrival in Port Stanley from Ireland. Alas, it has taken me until now, in my 88th year, editor's note, the date of this essay is 2003, to finally get down to business and try to put some true history on the doll. My husband and I visited the ancestral home at Kilrush, Wexford County, Ireland, in August 1972. This was no small Irish cottage. It is truly an ancestral home, and a lovely stone wall supports the entrance gates leading up to the house and farmland that was first leased by the Moorhouse family in 1750. The ancestral house was believed to have been built by William Moorhouse and was sold by his second son Thomas and wife Jane in 1802 prior to coming to Upper Canada in 1824. Jane gave birth to 11 children, all in this home, and brought all 11 out to Canada. Jane was the daughter of John Hopkins of Strathnakelly, County Wicklow. In Ireland, John was referred to as a gentleman. It is recorded in the Moorhouse history that Jane, wife of Thomas, always had servants and never did manual work before coming to Canada. The size of the ancestral house would confirm this observation, as well as her status in the Hopkins family. Her first son, John, was named after her father, John Hopkins. If John Hopkins was considered a gentleman, or at least above poverty level, this would mean Jane was exposed to some of the finer things in life, perhaps even a special doll, which she would have dressed in the mode of the day. It is reported that many young women owned these dolls, and that they were placed under exhibit under vitrines. Also, in reading extensively about dolls, it is recorded that about 50 or so wooden doll factories existed in London, England from 1790 to 1810. These were located in the center of this big city and did a roaring business. Jane would have been 16 in 1799, and she married at 18 in 1802. I'm presuming this doll would have belonged to Jane. Maria, who drowned at the Talbot Settlement at 3 years of age, would have been too young to have had a display doll or to be allowed to play with it. Jane's first daughter, Anne, born in 1809 after the arrival of 3 sons, would have been 15 by the time they arrived in Upper Canada. It is possible that it was her doll or given to her by Jane, or perhaps she may also have been too young to fully appreciate it. Either way, one imagines that the doll was carefully packed in a trunk to sail on her way to Canada. I imagine they sailed from Wexford, the very harbour in Ireland that we arrived at in 1972. The family of Thomas Moorhouse's brother Henry had settled in the Brockville area a bit earlier. Perhaps this was the district in which Thomas had intended to settle, but for some reason they bypassed it for the Talbot Settlement, landing at Port Stanley. How they survived the crossing and the transportation from Montreal, I do not know, doll and all. They settled for 15 months at Plum Creek, Lot 16, Concession 12, Dunwich, on Colonel Talbot's settlement. A close friend, Richard Dobbin, also immigrated from Wexford, Ireland in 1811. He had settled in Bear Creek Zone Township sometime before Thomas arrived, and he persuaded Thomas to join him there on Lot 25, Concession 2, of what is now Euphemia Township, Lambton County. Here they built a log home. Anne, their first daughter, was ready to marry William Pierce, born 1805 and dying 1890, married on January 4th, 1831, and she moved to Dunwich Township, Wallacestown. It is interesting to note that Anne was confirmed on August 21st, 1827, at the first confirmation service held at Colonel Leslie Patterson's home. Furthermore, Anne Backus taught Anne Moorhouse to spin and weave. So could the doll have passed to Anne Moorhouse from Jane as a confirmation gift? Or perhaps at her wedding? Or even more simply, because Anne was the firstborn daughter? Anne and William Pierce had 7 children. The first child was a daughter, Frances, born 1831 and dying in 1872. Frances married Isaac Simpson and had one child, William, who died the following year in 1872. Alas, Frances also died in 1872. Anne and William's third child arrived, a daughter, Jane, born 1835, dying in 1914. Jane was married in approximately 1857 to Robert Backus. She had 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl. The fourth child and only daughter was named Anne Frances, or Fanny, born in 1874 and dying in 1939. Jane would have given birth to Fanny when she was 39. Fanny married Edward Docker, and they had no children. Everyone knew her as Aunt Fanny. It was Fanny Docker who said to her husband Ed, "Please give this to Muriel." And in accordance with her wishes, in the spring of 1945, the doll was graciously placed in my hands. If we assume that over the years, the doll was passed on from Jane Hopkins through to each firstborn or surviving daughter and or son, this would make this treasure at least 200 years old, possibly spanning the years 1800 to 2012. Assuming the above line of succession, the path she may have taken would look something like this. And this is a supposition of successions and transfer locations. First, Jane Hopkins Moorhouse married Thomas. Quite possibly this was her doll or came from her family. The location, they departed Kilrush, Wexford County, Ireland, and landed in the Talbot Settlement in 1824 and moved to Zone Township. Second would be Anne Moorhouse Pierce. Third, Anne Frances Pierce Simpson. Fourth, Jane Pierce Backus. 5, Anne Frances Fanny Backus Docker. And 6, David C. Neese and his wife Paula, the eldest son and daughter-in-law of Muriel Neese. Tyrconnell Heritage Society would like to acknowledge the Questers and David and Paula Neese for the funding to purchase the display case that now protects the Moorhouse doll. On your next visit to Backus-Page House Museum, you can find the doll upstairs in the northwest bedroom. We want to thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. And if you have any family heirlooms, please leave us a note about them and even a picture on some of our social media platforms. And please write down some notes about them, explain where they came from, even on an index card, so that if something happens to you, your family has a story, just like Muriel recorded here, that we shared with you today. Please share the podcast with your friends and follow us on all social media platforms at Backus-Page House. The Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society acknowledges the land we are on today as the traditional territory of First Nations people. As settlers at a settler-focused museum, we value both the significant historical and contemporary contributions of all Original peoples and ask how we can be supportive in Indigenous cultural renewal. Life in the Talbot Settlement is a production of Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Your host has been Angela Bobier. Music provided by Jack Witmer. And thanks to our producer, Katlyn Reintsma. To make a charitable donation, become a Tyrconnell Heritage Society member, and to contact the Backus-Page House Museum, please visit our website, www.backuspagehouse.ca. Thank you again for listening.